Hey guys, since we're not meeting for Unit 2, I wanted to create a video to show you how to get started writing CSS code inside of brackets. Now this video is not going to teach you everything about CSS. For that I have given you a bunch of reading, and actually I hope you've already done some reading before watching this video. In any case, let's get started. Here's a Photoshop file, and I want to basically take this website and start working on it as if a designer just handed me this website without really any context. So right away, I'm just going to start by building the HTML code for this top section. For starters, I'm going to need to get a measurement of at least how tall this section is. If I can select it, I can hit F8 and see that this section is 420 pixels tall. I'm going to go ahead and flesh out how I think the HTML would be for this. I think I'm going to go ahead and have everything in here be a header. I'm going to have this bar be a nav. And then I'm going to make the menu be an unordered list, and each of these will be list items with links inside of them. This right here, this can be an anchor tag, and this can be really any kind of tag, maybe an H1. Yeah, I think an H1 would be appropriate for that. We'll just jump over to brackets if it wants to. There we go. We'll create the index file and start with a template. For this anchor tag, I set its href attribute to £, and when the href attribute is set to £, it won't navigate anywhere. In fact, what it'll do is it will navigate to this page. It won't refresh the page, however, and it will look on the page for another anchor tag that has a name equivalent to whatever comes after this £. Now, we're not actually going to use that feature. I'm just going to have it be set to £, so that it looks like a clickable link, but it doesn't take us anywhere. Let's view this in a browser. This looks alright. Let's go ahead and start styling our header. Now, what we did before was we wrote CSS inline using the style tag, and we're not going to do that. Another way we could do it is by actually writing CSS on the page inside a style tag, and I don't want to do that either. In fact, I'm going to write all my CSS in an external CSS file. So we'll say new file, and I'm going to call it main.css. And the tag I want to style is the header tag, so I'm going to write a CSS rule. And this rule applies to any header elements. Alright, so we can set the height of this header to 420 pixels, and just so that we can see it, let's give it a background. Okay. Now the CSS isn't being applied to our page right now, and that's because our index file doesn't have any sort of reference to this CSS file. So we can add a reference by using the link tag. We'll say link href equals, and I will do main.css, and then rel basically says the relation that this tag has to the rest of this document, and this is a style sheet. And just like that, we get a reference to our style sheet, and our style is being pulled in here just fine. Now, before we write any more CSS, let's go ahead and get that background image saved out of Photoshop so that we can use it. I'm going to do a Control-Shift-C, Control-N, Control-V, and then Control-Shift-Alt-S. Now, I could save this as a JPEG. If I save it as a JPEG at this quality, it'll be 40 kilobytes. If I save it as a GIF or GIF, it will be substantially larger, and if I save it as a PNG, it'll be much larger. So we're going to go with a JPEG, and I'll create a images folder inside of my project, and we'll call this background underscore laptop. Okay. Let's go check it out. Okay, in our CSS, we're going to set our background not to this color, but to that image. You'll notice that around the perimeter of the page we have this little bit of margin. So that is a default property being applied to the body tag. We can nullify that with we can get rid of that effect by setting our body margin to 0. Now even when we do that, you'll notice that we have a little bit of gap on the top of the page. The source of that is kind of weird. There's actually a margin around this list. It happens to be pushing down the element that it's sitting inside of. There we go. And I just want to check the color of that nav bar. Now I've got the background color and opacity about correct on that nav bar. I want to go ahead and set the height to the correct height. So we'll just measure that. Okay, that's weird. Try that again. Let's create a guide and then measure with a marquee. And if we look up here, the height is 62 pixels. Now you'll notice that the list actually spills out of the nav, and that's okay. We actually want these list items to be kind of floating horizontally anyway. So what we can do is with this list, first of all, let's get rid of those bullet points. So we'll say list style none, and also I want to remove the padding. Oops. I want the anchor tags inside of that list to float to the left. Okay, so now they're kind of floating one each next to the other. And I want to give them, essentially I want the boxes that they're in to stretch out vertically. I could set each box to have a height of 62 pixels. But there is a slightly better way of doing that, because then if we did that, we'd still have to worry about centering this text inside of that box. And the way you would do that is you basically take the line height of the text and you'd set it equal to the size of the box, which we're going to do anyway. So line height 62 pixels, that stretches that out. So those are the clickable boxes for the anchors. And now they each have to have some padding inside. So if we go to Photoshop, we can measure that. There's also a little bit of a gradient on this right here, but you can always return and add that later. To hide and show a single element like that, or basically to solo an element, what I'm doing is I'm holding Alt and I'm clicking on the eyeball, and it'll solo whatever layer you do that to. Okay, one thing I just noticed is that this nav bar actually has a drop shadow too. So if we look right here, the drop shadow has an opacity of 25% and has a size of 3, a distance of 2, going straight down. So let's see if we can replicate that. So this nav bar is this element right here. We're going to say box shadow, and let's say you didn't know, the values, what to type in for the property for box shadow. When you are editing a CSS file here inside of brackets, for any property, you can hit, basically put your cursor inside of it, and you can hit Control K, and it will show you some documentation for that particular property and its potential values. If you want more information about any property, you can click this Read More button. It will take you out to the web where you can find a much more detailed documentation. So for the box shadow, I'm basically going to give it a 0, 0 offset. I'm going to blur it by 10 pixels, and then I'm going to set that shadow to black. And that's what it looks like. Now remember, the box shadow in Photoshop, it was black, but it had an opacity of, I want to say 25%. Yeah. So let's tweak what we have in this other file. Instead of using a hex code here, we are going to say RGBA, and we'll basically type in black with a 25% value for the opacity. It just occurred to me I probably don't want to make this entire nav bar have an opacity of 0.9, because that will affect not only the box shadow, but it will affect the content inside of it. See, if I set this down to 0.1, we can hardly see those links at all. So what I'm going to do is, instead of setting this opacity value to 0.9, I'm going to set the background color to have an opacity value of 0.9. So in order to do that, we have to basically enter in the same color, except we need to use RGBA. So we have to figure out what is the decimal value of the hexadecimal D3. So I'm just going to pop open Calculator real quick, and I'm in the programmer view of Calculator. And if I go to hex and I type in D3 and I bounce back to decimal, I can see that the value is 211. So RGBA 211, 211, 211, and 0.9 for our opacity value. And voila. Now for our box shadow, in Photoshop it said it had a size of 3. Here I'm saying it has a blurriness of 10. I don't know if those values are exactly equivalent. So if I type in a 3 pixel here, I don't know if it's going to look exactly the same as Photoshop, but it will probably be a little bit closer. Plus in Photoshop it's bumped down 2 pixels, so I'll do the same thing here. So that should look about the same. Okay. Now, let's get these buttons to look correct. If we get in close and we measure the space between them, it's about 36 pixels. So if we were to divide 36 by 2, we would get 18 and 18, and that's how much these boxes should have for padding on the inside. They should have about 18 pixels of padding. So we're going to say for these anchor tags, they have a padding of 0 on the top and 18 on the left and right. And there we go. The buttons now have room to breathe. I want the font size for this entire document, or excuse me, the font family for this entire document to be Arial. So I'm going to go up to body and we'll say font family and I got Arial from just looking at this document. You'd have to come in here and put your cursor inside this and check to see. In fact, this says it's Arial bold. So for these links, I will come out here and say that they have a font weight of bold. And I want to get rid of that underline in there, so we will adjust their text decoration value to none. And let's try to get that color correct. If we come in here to Photoshop, you'll notice that we have two states for these buttons. Now presumably this is either the rollover state or the current state, and this is the, the regular. But in any case, if I put my cursor in there and we take a peek at the color, it's 313131. And if we take a peek at this color over here, it's also 313131. So really the difference here is probably opacity. So if I select either of these and I take a look at the layer's opacity value, we can see that the About has an opacity of 100 and Products has an opacity of 40. So let's replicate that. Over here, we're going to say that the color is 313131. And we're going to basically say they have an opacity of 0.4. Now, if we want to give these a rollover state, we can do that easily enough. We would define another rule using something called a pseudo class selector. And it's basically after the A, we're going to say colon and then the name of the state. So for example, hover. Now there should not be a space before or after the colon. And what this will do is it will now define a style that it will define style properties for when we hover over these. So if we want to say when we hover over it, we set the opacity to 1, we can do that and come over here and test it. That looks good. And if we want to add just a little bit more pizzazz, we can actually make it animate. So what I'm going to do is make it animate so that when you roll over, it goes from 0.4 to 1, but it animates that over a second or half a second. So that's a new feature in CSS 3. We can say transition for any element. And with this transition property, we specify another property that we want to transition. So that would be opacity. And then we specify how many seconds we want the transition to take place over. So I'm going to say 1s for 1 second. And now when I hover over, it gradually fades. It's interesting. It's actually being a little weird. We're going to try to reload. There we go. Okay. Now 1 second is far too slow. I'm going to bump that down to 0.25 seconds so that the fade happens much more quickly. Okay, looking good. Let's take this nav bar and let's, not the nav bar, but let's take the menu and now slide it over to the right. This is kind of weird. I want the menu buttons to kind of float to the left so that About is first, and then Products floats to the left next to that, and then Purchase floats to the left next to that. But I want the container that it's in to actually float to the right. This is a little tricky, but where there's a will, there's a way. Sometimes what I do is I'll swap these around. I'll basically say, and I'll make the change now, I'll tell these to float to the right instead. But you'll notice that when I tell these individual links to float to the right, their ordering changes around. So that About, which used to be the leftmost item, is now the rightmost item in this menu. So I don't really like that. I'm going to tell them to float to the left. And real quick, the solution to that could be just in your HTML to change the ordering around. But I don't like that. I feel like good HTML should preserve the content, even if the CSS was stripped away. But anyway, what I'm going to do is tell this UL, the actual list itself, to float to the right. Now, what that does is that it prevents that element from expanding, and now it tries to stay small like this. If I change the display of the object. There's lots of different choices, but I found that if I change the display to flex, it fixes that issue for me. Now, earlier I showed you that if you put your cursor inside of any property, you can hit Control K and get the documentation for that property, which is really nice. But there are some other really fun tricks you can do here in brackets. If you put your cursor in a value, let's say like a color value, and you hit Control E, you actually get a color picker. So here I can basically set my color using RGB. I can set it with HSL or hex. I can do a variety of options here for selecting color visually. Another really cool feature is that after a while, this is a really good start, but what we're going to start doing is writing HTML and then bouncing back to CSS, and it's going to be a constant bounce back and forth between these two files. Now, one of the options is to do a split screen. So here in brackets, you can click this button and say make a vertical split, and then drag the CSS file over to the right pane. So now you've got HTML and CSS side by side, but there is another solution. The other way to do it is when you're editing HTML files, you can put your cursor inside of any element and hit Control E. What that does is it searches any CSS files that are attached to this HTML file, and it finds any rules that are applied to this particular element. If there are multiple rules that can be applied to this element, they'll be over here, and you can select between different rules. And that way you can actually edit in here very quickly the CSS of any element you're working on. Okay, next up, I want to add this generic company label to my website. Now this uses a custom font, and since I don't use that font throughout my website, I don't want to force users to download it, and I certainly don't want it to be replaced with a different font. So I'm going to save this out as an image. Control Shift C, Control N, Control V, Control Alt Shift S, and then this only uses a couple colors, so a GIF or GIF will do nicely. I'll say no dither. And while we're in here, we might as well save out this little logo up here. Since this logo has transparency and it has a drop shadow, I want to save it out as a PNG. The GIF files do not support, true alpha channels, so we don't want to use them if we've got complex alpha. Okay, so I have this image in there. This is our label, and for good HTML, we should have an alt tag in there. It's just a label for the company. I guess I'll write generic company in there. Really, the alt tag is for if someone can't see the image. It's a description of what the image is. Yeah, I don't know in this case what you would say. Generic company logo if it's the logo. In any case, let's write some CSS for this. I'm going to put my cursor in here and press Control E. There are no rules that apply to this tag, so I'll click New Rule, and I want to write a rule for this tag that uses the ID. So we'll say #label, and we want to position it in the center of its parent element. So right away, we could say margin 0 auto, and that should center it left to right. Oh, that doesn't. It doesn't center it left to right because images are not, their display type is not block. But if we set it to block, it'll play nice. Alright, how many pixels down? Come into Photoshop and we get a measurement. It is 138 pixels down. So the top margin should be 138 pixels, and it doesn't need a bottom margin, so we'll just do 0 there. And there we go. The next element we want to place is a logo up here in the nav bar. So I will put that, of course, in nav. And it doesn't really matter if I put it before the menu or after the menu. But again, I want to think, if the user doesn't have any CSS, what would be the appropriate way to lay out the website if the CSS was stripped away? And I think I would want the logo first before the menu. But it's your choice. We'll say a href, and let's just pretend this would be a link that would take the user back to the home page. I'm going to say ID equals logo. And we can leave it at that, really. We don't have to put an image tag in there. I'll show you what we'll do instead. I'm going to put my cursor in here and press Control E. And these rules should not apply to this element because it's not in the UL or an LI. So that's interesting. I'm going to say new rule. And this rule will apply to any element with ID of logo. And I'm going to set the background of the anchor tag to be that logo image. Now, we're not seeing it because since the anchor tag doesn't have any content in it, it has a width of 0 and a height of 0. So I want to set it equal to be the width and height of this logo. If I hover over the logo, I can see that it is 54 pixels by 47. Okay, I'm still not seeing it. The reason I'm not seeing it is because anchor tags have a display type of inline. Any objects that have a display type of inline, I cannot manually set their width and height. So the solution here is to set its display type to block. And once I've done that, we can see that there is the logo. You'll notice that the menu has been bumped down. The menu is bumped down because this image tag is above it in the code, and now that it has a block type, nothing can go on the line with it, unless of course we set this logo to be floating. So if we tell the logo to float to the left, this menu bounces back up there. Now we want to give this logo some margins so that it's offset a little bit. So if we look in the Photoshop file, we can guess approximately where that would need to be. Okay, so I'm going to approximate that it needs 9 pixels of padding on top and 50 pixels to the left. All right, there's the top part of our website. It's looking pretty good. One of the problems you'll notice that you will have is that the layout of the website in Photoshop is 1280 pixels wide. When you start designing websites, you will find out that websites, their width and height changes based off of the user's resolution or their device, or both, or how they want to resize the window. So that messes up our layout quite a bit. You'll notice that the background now is repeating in this area in a way that I didn't really want it to. When you look at the Photoshop file, you don't really know if the designer intended for this to be a fixed width website or a liquid layout, or if the designer really thought that far ahead. So I want you to think about what you would do if you were given this Photoshop file without any sort of direction from the client, and how you might solve this problem. Take a look at some other websites and think about maybe how they've solved this problem. That's it for the video. Be sure to check out the other additional reading materials before trying to take the quiz, and I will see you guys next week.